The third riddle we'll look at before we take a break is Jesus and the rich young man. One of my favorite stories in the gospel. Sorry, I ran out of space here. Okay, so this will be number 3. Jesus and the rich young man. I bring this one up because I think this is one of the most potentially misleading riddles. Like, this one's tough. And it's actually been used by scholars to deny that Jesus was divine. Actually, or should I say, used by some scholars to say that Jesus denied that he was divine. And the church preserved it. All right, here's the story. Mark chapter 10. As he was setting out on a journey, a man ran up and knelt before him and asked him, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" This is the verse that John Paul II constructs the whole moral theology of Veritatis Splendor around this. Okay, although he uses the Matthew version, I think. In any case, Jesus said to him, "Why do you call me good? No one is good." And here, back to the same Greek. No one is good but the one God. No one is good. You know the commandments. Do not kill. Do not commit adultery. Do not steal. Do not bear false witness. Do not defraud. Honor your father and your mother. And he said to him, "Teacher, all these I have observed from my youth." I was a good boy, you know. I kept the commandments. I never killed anybody. Right? You've heard that before. Jesus, looking upon him, loved him and said, "You lack one thing. Go, sell what you have, give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. And come, follow me." At that saying, his countenance, meaning his face, fell, and he went away sorrowful, for he had great possessions. Mark 10, 17 through 22. All right. Woo, a lot going on here. Good stuff. All right. So let's just walk through the basic points, though. Young man addresses Jesus with a respectful title, right? Good teacher. That's what initiates the whole exchange. He calls him, like you guys do sometimes, see me in hall. Good professor, right? You can do that if you like. It's all right. No, this was obviously, this is an honorific, right? He's honoring Jesus as a rabbi, as a teacher. And Jesus responds to that honorific, that title, with a question, right? Throws it back on. He always does this. Jesus asks questions. Why do you call me good? No one is good but God alone. So the young man says, "Good teacher," and Jesus' response, that's the young man, Jesus' response is a question. Why do you call me good? And then the money quote here is, "No one is good but the one God." I'm going to translate it literally to follow Mark there. Now, I was recently at a conference where they were discussing Bart Ehrman's book, How Jesus Became God, and Dale Martin, who used to teach at Duke, but now teaches at Yale. We were discussing the whole issue of whether Jesus claims to be divine in the Synoptic. I mean, we weren't discussing. I was in the audience. They were discussing. But I was listening, and Dr. Martin immediately jumped on. There was some commentator, one of the people in the audience asked about the divinity of Jesus in Synoptics, and he jumped on this passage. He says, "Look at Mark 10. Jesus clearly denies that he's divine. When the rich young man comes to him and says, 'Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?' Jesus says, 'You're wrong. No one is good except God alone.'" What clearer evidence could we possibly need to show that Jesus is saying, "I'm not God"? Because he's rebuking the young man for attributing goodness to him, which is only true of God. He's like, case closed. It's over. Well, maybe, and maybe not. All right? So, on the one hand, if the story ended there, if that was the end of the story, that would be a really good interpretation of it. That would be a very plausible and reasonable account, if that was the end of the story. And the young man went away sad because he thought Jesus was God, but he wasn't. But that's not the end. You can only interpret the text that way if you take it out of context. Exactly. So you got to put everything Jesus says in context, right? So if you follow that reasoning that I just gave you, that Jesus is denying that he's God, then something follows. So this is the skeptics' interpretation. This is what they say. Jesus is denying that he's God. Jesus is saying, no one is good but God alone. So no one is good but God. Now, if you follow that logic, what then is Jesus claiming? Jesus is saying, I'm not God. But in context, he would also be saying what? I'm not good. That's the whole point, no? No one is good but God alone. So if you think he's denying that he's divine, he also has to be denying the guys ascribing goodness to him, because that was what he said. So according to that interpretation, Jesus is not only denying that he's God, he's denying that he's good. Only God's good. Now, why is that a problem? Because it doesn't fit with the second half of the text. The rest of the story doesn't make sense if Jesus is denying he's good. Because what does he go on to do? Keep reading. The guy says, I've kept the commandments. So he's like, I've kept the 10 commandments. Who gave the 10 commandments? Yeah, I've done the stuff Yahweh says I have to do to have eternal life. And Jesus says, you're missing something. You're lacking something. The 10 commandments that were written by the finger of God on the tablets of stone, the highest expression of divine law, that's not enough. You got to do something else if you want eternal life. You know what that something else is? You have to give everything up and then come and follow, watch where your finger goes, me. That's a problem. Jesus adds something to the 10 Commandments. The necessity of following, not Yahweh, he didn't say go and follow Yahweh, but of following who? Following him. Now that obliterates, in my opinion, Martin's argument. Because if Jesus' point is that he's not good, then what the heck is he saying? You have to follow me. If you want to have eternal life, you got to come and follow me because I'm really wicked. I'm a bad man. Does that make any sense? Say no. No, of course it doesn't make any sense, right? This is really important. Remember the logic. If Jesus is denying that he's God, then he's also denying that he's good. And if he's denying that he's good, then it doesn't make any sense for him to tell the guy, the only thing you're lacking for eternal life is to follow me. But if it's a riddle, then it makes sense. Because what he says, notice what he says here. Notice what he says and what he doesn't. He does not say, I am not good. That's not what he says. He says, why do you call me good when no one is good but God? You see the riddle? You get it now? He didn't say I'm not good. He said, why are you saying that about me? When you know and I know that no one's good except for who? God. So I would actually say the whole point of his question is basically saying to the young man, you are on to something, but you need to follow the train of your own thought to its logical end. You and I know that no one's good but God alone, and yet you just called me good. So let me ask you the question, who do you think that I am? How can you say that? That's what's implicit in the riddle, all right? And again, you don't have to take my word for it. I know we're late again. This is what I meant about these classes, a little packed. Again, look at Greenheim at the bottom. Quote on page 41. The most natural way to read the first part of the saying is that Jesus wants the rich man to make clear what he means. In other words, Jesus wants to elicit from the man what he thinks about Jesus. The diverging interpretations of this saying continue to demonstrate the openness of Jesus' words. He doesn't make a statement about himself, but he provokes the audience, in this case the young man in particular, to make their what? Their own judgment. And that is standard Jesus in the Gospels. What's he saying over and over again? Who do you say I am? That's what he wants Peter. They're like, well, some people say this, some people say that. Okay, forget about that. Who do you think I am? Because faith in Jesus' divinity is not something he's going to shove down your throat. He wants you to come to it. He wants you to make a choice about who he is and then what you're going to do about it. All right, turn the page. We'll close here, just a couple of quick points here. Again, Simon Gathercole, he's an acquaintance of mine. We're not close friends or anything, but we've met on a few occasions, and I really like his work. He teaches at Cambridge. He says in his book, what is most striking is that having established the one good God as the one who defines what is required of human beings, the 10 Commandments, in the final analysis, Jesus is the one who defines what is ultimately commanded. If God alone is good and able to give the commandments, then Jesus does so as well. In other words, he just gave an 11th commandment. Here's the 11th commandment. Come and follow me. That's the 11th commandment. By implication, then, he is also good. And he is good not in the sense implied by the rich man, but in the absolute divine sense used by Jesus himself. Okay? So, in closing then, each of these riddles of Jesus is meant to draw you into the mystery of his divine identity. that he's both concealing and revealing. And the only way to see it is if you know the Old Testament, right? So in the healing of the paralytic, you've got to know Daniel 7 and the heavenly Son of Man to get that he's claiming to be divine. And the second one, the riddle of David's son, you've got to know Psalm 110 to get the point that he's claiming to be David's Lord and the pre-existent Messiah. And then in the riddle of the rich young man, you've got to know the Ten Commandments and the Shema, the one God, to get the point that Jesus is asserting his authority and his divine prerogative to give a command that's necessary for eternal life, by the way. We're talking about eternal life here. Can you think of any other teacher who's going to say, oh, if you don't follow me, you're damned? That's a really high claim, okay? That's the riddle of Jesus' divinity. And in closing, I've given you some quotes here. They're in the book. You can look at them later. But all I want to show you here is each one of these riddles, I didn't make this up. The church fathers saw this like 1,500 years ago. So Novatian, John Chrysostom, Augustine, Ambrose, and Chrysostom take each one of these passages and basically break it down exactly as I've given it to you, almost exactly. And each one saying, Jesus is claiming to be divine, but he's doing it through riddles and questions, right? I'll just take one.